I never imagined my own mother would walk away from me in a five-star hotel lobby and leave me with nothing but a crumpled $20 bill and the clothes on my back. But when I woke up that Tuesday morning in the penthouse suite, I'd upgraded to using her platinum card. I realized sometimes the best revenge is living well. It took me 3 days to understand that being abandoned was actually the best thing that ever happened to me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Julie Jackson, and the morning everything changed started with what I thought was going to be the perfect family reunion. I was 28 years old, working as a graphic designer in Portland, and I hadn't seen my family in over 2 years. When my mother Patricia called and said she wanted to take me and my sister Monica on a luxury vacation to the Grandview Resort in Napa Valley, I actually cried with relief. I thought it meant we were finally going to work through all the tension that had been building between us since my father's death 3 years earlier. I should have known something was wrong when Patricia insisted on booking separate rooms. She claimed it was because Monica snored, and I stayed up too late working on my laptop. But looking back, I realized she was already planning what would happen next. I should have paid attention to the way Monica kept checking her phone during dinner our first night, or how Patricia kept asking detailed questions about my finances and whether I had any savings left after paying for Dad's medical bill. The Grandview Resort was everything I'd dreamed a luxury hotel would be. Marble floors that gleamed under crystal chandeliers, staff members who remembered your name after meeting you once, and a view of the valley that made you forget there was a world beyond those rolling hills. I felt like I was living in a movie, especially when Patricia handed me a glass of champagne in the lobby and said she was proud of how I'd handled everything after Dad passed away. For 48 hours I believed my family actually wanted me there. Our last morning together I woke up early and headed down to the lobby around 7, hoping to catch Patricia before she left for her spa appointment. I was wearing my favorite sundress, the yellow one with tiny white flowers that Dad always said made me look like sunshine, and I was carrying the small gift I'd bought for Monica at the hotel boutique. It was a silver bracelet with a charm that said "Sisters Forever," and I couldn't wait to give it to her as a peace offering for all the fights we'd had over the years. The lobby was mostly empty except for a few guests checking out, and the front desk staff preparing for the morning rush. I settled into one of the plush velvet chairs near the concierge desk and ordered coffee from room service, planning to wait until Patricia came down. I remember feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months, thinking about how we might start having regular family trips, how maybe Monica and I could be close again the way we were when we were kids. I waited for over an hour before I started to feel uneasy. Patricia was never late for anything, especially not spa appointments she'd been talking about for days. I tried calling her room, but there was no answer. When I called Monica's room, it went straight to voicemail. I told myself they'd probably just left early and forgotten to mention it, but something in my stomach was starting to twist into a knot. I decided to go up to Patricia's room on the 8th floor and knock, thinking maybe she'd overslept. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, and by the time I reached her door my hands were shaking slightly. I knocked softly at first, then louder when there was no response. Finally, I pressed my ear to the door and realized I couldn't hear any movement inside. The silence felt wrong, too complete. I went back down to the front desk and asked the clerk, a young woman named Stephanie, with perfectly styled blonde hair, if she could call Patricia's room for me. She dialed the number and waited, then shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but there's no answer. Would you like me to try your sister's room as well?" When Monica's room also went unanswered, Stephanie's expression shifted to concern. She excused herself and spoke quietly to her manager, a tall man in a navy suit, who kept glancing in my direction. That's when Stephanie returned with news that made my blood run cold. "Miss Jackson, I'm sorry to inform you that both rooms were checked out early this morning around 6 a.m. The guests left instructions that any messages should be held at the front desk." My mouth felt dry as cotton as I processed what she was saying. I asked if they'd left any messages for me, and she disappeared into the back office for what felt like an eternity. When she returned, she was holding a white hotel envelope with my name written across it in Patricia's precise handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it, and inside was a single sheet of hotel stationery with a brief note that would change everything. Julie, we've gone ahead with our plan. You're an adult now and it's time you learn to take care of yourself. The $20 should cover a taxi to the airport. Don't contact us. That was it. No explanation, no apology, just a dismissal that felt like a slap across the face. I read the note 3 times before the words really sank in. Then I looked up at Stephanie, who was watching me with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern, and I realized she'd probably known when they checked out that morning, maybe even helped them coordinate their early departure. The knowledge that my family had planned this abandonment, had discussed it with hotel staff while I slept, made me feel sick to my stomach. I excused myself and walked quickly to the ladies' room near the lobby, where I locked myself in a stall and tried not to hyperventilate. My mind was racing with questions I couldn't answer. Why would they bring me here just to leave me? What had I done that was so terrible they couldn't even say goodbye to my face? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and tried calling Patricia's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Monica's phone was the same. They'd probably turned them off the moment they left the hotel. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, trying to figure out what to do next. The $20 bill Patricia had left felt like an insult, barely enough to cover a taxi to the nearest bus station, let alone get me back to Portland. I had my debit card, but my checking account had maybe $300 in it, certainly not enough for a last-minute flight or even a few nights in a cheap motel. The realization that I was essentially stranded hit me like a physical blow. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, I noticed that Stephanie kept glancing at me while she helped other guests. I could see the pity in her eyes, and it made my cheeks burn with embarrassment. I was the girl whose family had abandoned her at a luxury resort, the pathetic daughter who hadn't even seen it coming. I wanted to disappear, to somehow undo the last hour and wake up in my room with Patricia knocking on the door to ask if I wanted to have breakfast together. Instead, I found myself walking back to the front desk, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. When Stephanie looked up with that same sympathetic expression, I cleared my throat and tried to sound more confident than I felt. I need to ask you something, I said quietly. When my mother and sister checked out this morning, did they settle their bill? Stephanie nodded, looking confused by the question. Yes, ma'am. The charges were settled in full. That's when the first spark of an idea began to form in my mind. I knew Patricia always carried multiple credit cards, and I remembered her mentioning during dinner that she'd put everything on her Platinum American Express card to earn points for future travel. I also remembered something else, something that made my pulse quicken with possibility. 2 years ago, when Dad was in the hospital, Patricia had added me as an authorized user on that same card so I could handle his medical expenses while she was traveling for work. I'd never used the card for anything personal, never even thought about it really, but technically my name was still on the account. Patricia had probably forgotten about it entirely, focused as she was on her grand gesture of abandonment. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who'd just left me with $20 had unknowingly given me access to unlimited purchasing power. I walked back to the velvet chair where I'd been sitting earlier and pulled out my phone to check my wallet app. There it was, stored from 2 years ago when I'd first added it, Patricia's Platinum card information, including the security code I'd memorized for the hospital payment. My heart was pounding as I realized what I could do with this information, but I forced myself to think carefully about the consequences. Part of me knew I should just use the card to book a flight home and deal with Patricia's anger later. But a larger part of me, the part that had been hurt and humiliated and dismissed, wanted to do something that would make a statement. I thought about all the times Patricia had criticized my life choices, my job, my apartment, my inability to save money after Dad's medical bills had drained my account. I thought about how she'd probably expected me to panic, to beg for help, to prove her point that I couldn't take care of myself. I looked around the lobby, taking in the opulent surroundings that I'd been enjoying for 2 days as Patricia's guest. The crystal chandeliers, the fresh flowers that were probably replaced daily, the view of the valley that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. I thought about the penthouse suite I'd seen advertised in the hotel's welcome packet, the one that cost more per night than I made in a month. Suddenly I knew exactly what I was going to do. I walked back to the front desk with a confidence I didn't entirely feel but was determined to project. Stephanie looked up with that same concerned expression, probably expecting me to ask about shuttle schedules or cheap nearby accommodation. Instead, I smiled and said, "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd like to upgrade my room, please. I'll be staying for a few more days, and I want the penthouse suite." Stephanie's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "The penthouse suite," she repeated, as if she needed to confirm she'd heard me correctly. I nodded, maintaining my smile even though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Yes. The one with the wraparound terrace and the private hot tub. I believe it's available starting tonight." She glanced at her computer screen, then back at me with obvious confusion. "Ma'am, that suite is $1,800 per night." The number made my stomach flip, but I kept my expression neutral. "That's fine," I said calmly. "I'll be paying with my American Express Platinum card." I recited the number from memory, along with the security code and expiration date, while Stephanie typed everything into her system. I held my breath as she processed the transaction, half expecting the card to be declined or for some kind of alarm to go off. Instead, after what felt like an eternity, she looked up with a professional smile. "The transaction has been approved, Ms. Jackson. When would you like to check into the penthouse?" I felt a rush of adrenaline, so intense I had to grip the edge of the marble counter to steady myself. "Right now would be perfect," I managed to say. As Stephanie arranged for my luggage to be transferred from my original room to the penthouse, I felt something shifting inside me. The hurt and confusion from Patricia's abandonment were still there, but they were being overshadowed by something else, a fierce determination to prove that I was more capable than any of them had given me credit for. If Patricia wanted me to learn to take care of myself, then that's exactly what I was going to do. The bellhop who escorted me to the penthouse was a middle-aged man named Charles, who treated me with the same deference he'd show any guest staying in an $1,800 per night suite. He didn't know I was the abandoned daughter to him. I was just another wealthy guest enjoying the finer things in life. As we rode the elevator to the top floor, I caught my reflection in the mirrored walls and barely recognized myself. There was something different in my eyes, a hardness that hadn't been there that morning. When Charles opened the door to the penthouse suite, I had to fight to keep my expression composed. The space was larger than my entire apartment in Portland, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the valley. The living room was decorated in cream and gold, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. The bedroom featured a king-sized bed with Egyptian cotton sheets, and a marble bathroom that included both a rainfall shower and a deep soaking tub. But it was the wraparound terrace that truly took my breath away. Charles led me outside, where comfortable seating areas were arranged around a private hot tub and fire pit. The view was spectacular, stretching for miles across vineyards and rolling hills that seemed to go on forever. "The terrace is private," Charles explained, "and room service is available 24 hours a day. Is there anything else you need to make your stay comfortable?" I tipped him generously with cash from Patricia's $20 bill, enjoying the irony of using her insulting farewell gift for something she'd never intended. After he left, I stood alone on the terrace and let the full magnitude of what I'd done sink in. I had just charged nearly $2,000 to my mother's credit card for a single night in a hotel suite, and somehow I felt more empowered than guilty. I spent the rest of that first day exploring every inch of the penthouse, ordering room service meals I'd never dreamed of trying, and sitting on the terrace with a glass of champagne, watching the sun set over the valley. Every few hours I checked my phone to see if Patricia or Monica had tried to contact me, but there were no missed calls or messages. Their silence confirmed what I'd already suspected. They'd expected me to slink home quietly, probably broke and humiliated, ready to accept whatever scraps of attention they might throw my way in the future. That night, as I soaked in the private hot tub under a canopy of stars, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to use Patricia's card just to spite her or to prove a point about my own independence. I was going to use this opportunity to figure out what I really wanted from my life, away from the toxic dynamics and constant criticism that had defined my relationship with my family for years. I pulled out my laptop and started researching the local area, looking for activities and experiences that would help me understand what made me happy when I wasn't trying to please other people. I booked wine tastings at boutique vineyards, art classes at a local studio, and hiking tours through the mountains. I made dinner reservations at restaurants I'd only read about in magazines, places where Patricia would have criticized me for ordering the wrong wine or wearing the wrong outfit. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I was going to live entirely for myself, and if Patricia wanted to cut me out of her life for it, then that was her choice to make. I was done trying to earn love from people who saw me as nothing more than a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. The penthouse suite was just the beginning of my real life, the life I was going to build on my own terms. As I drifted off to sleep in the enormous bed, surrounded by luxury I'd never imagined I could afford, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine excitement about the future. Tomorrow, I would start the process of becoming the person I'd always wanted to be, free from the expectations and limitations my family had placed on me. And if that journey happened to cost Patricia a small fortune in the process, well, that was just an added bonus. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows woke me slowly, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I remembered: the penthouse, the credit card, the abandonment that had somehow transformed into liberation. I stretched luxuriously in the massive bed, and realized I felt more rested than I had in months, possibly years. There was something about sleeping in a space where no one could find me, where no one expected anything from me, that had allowed my body to truly relax. I ordered breakfast from room service, choosing items I'd never tried before: eggs Benedict with truffle hollandaise, fresh fruit that probably cost more than my usual weekly grocery budget, and coffee that had been flown in from some exotic location I couldn't pronounce. When the server wheeled the cart onto the terrace, I felt like I was living in a dream, or maybe like I'd finally woken up from a nightmare I hadn't realized I was trapped in. While I ate, I checked my phone again for any messages from Patricia or Monica. Still nothing. Part of me had expected Patricia to notice the charges on her credit card statement by now and call to demand an explanation, but her continued silence suggested she was even more determined to cut me out of her life than I'd realized. The knowledge should have hurt, but instead it felt like confirmation that I was making the right choice by staying. I spent that second morning exploring the hotel's amenities that I'd been too intimidated to use during our family stay. I booked a massage at the spa, signed up for a private yoga session, and made an appointment to have my hair and makeup done at the salon. If I was going to be living as a penthouse guest, I decided I might as well look the part. Each treatment was charged to the room, which meant it went directly to Patricia's card, and I found myself caring less and less about the mounting bill. The spa was a revelation. I'd never had a professional massage before, never understood why people spent so much money on what seemed like an unnecessary luxury. But as the therapist worked out years of tension from my shoulders and neck, I realized this wasn't about indulgence, it was about self-care, something I'd never learned to prioritize. The yoga instructor helped me understand that my body had been holding stress in ways I hadn't even recognized, and the breathing techniques she taught me made me feel more centered than I had in years. At the salon, I asked them to do something completely different with my hair. I'd been wearing the same shoulder-length style for years, mainly because Patricia had once told me it was flattering for my face shape, which I now realized was just another way she'd controlled my choices. The stylist suggested a shorter cut with layers that would emphasize my natural waves, and when I saw the final result, I barely recognized myself. I looked confident, sophisticated, like someone who belonged in a penthouse suite. That afternoon, I drove to one of the vineyard tours I'd booked, using the hotel's concierge service to arrange transportation. The driver treated me with the same respect he'd show any hotel guest, and I found myself enjoying the role I was playing. At the vineyard, I learned about wine production and tasting techniques from a sommelier, who assumed I was simply another affluent tourist, enjoying the Napa Valley experience. For the first time in my adult life, no one was judging my knowledge, or correcting my pronunciation, or making me feel like I didn't belong. I bought several bottles of wine to be shipped to my apartment in Portland, charging everything to the room account. With each purchase, I felt myself growing bolder, more comfortable with the idea that I deserved nice things, that I didn't have to justify every expense, or feel guilty for spending money on experiences that brought me joy. Patricia had always made me feel like I was fiscally irresponsible, but now I realized she'd simply never wanted me to have the independence that financial freedom could provide. That evening, I had dinner at the hotel's five-star restaurant, sitting alone at a table that overlooked the valley, and ordering the tasting menu with wine pairings. The waitstaff treated me like a valued guest, not like someone who was dining alone because she'd been abandoned by her family. The food was extraordinary, each course more creative and delicious than anything I'd ever tasted, and I found myself savoring not just the flavors, but the entire experience of being somewhere beautiful with no agenda other than my own pleasure. During dinner, I overheard a conversation at the next table between two women who were discussing their daughter's career choices. One was expressing frustration that her daughter had chosen to be a teacher instead of pursuing law or medicine, and I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach as I recognized the dynamic. It was the same dismissive attitude Patricia had always shown toward my work as a graphic designer, as if creativity was somehow less valuable than more traditional forms of success. But sitting there in my expensive dress, with professional makeup and my new haircut, eating food that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week, I realized something important. I was successful. Maybe not in the way Patricia defined success, but in ways that mattered to me. I had built a career doing work I loved, had clients who respected my artistic vision, and had managed to support myself entirely through my own efforts. The fact that I'd never made a lot of money didn't diminish the value of what I'd accomplished. After dinner, I returned to the penthouse and spent the evening on the terrace, wrapped in the luxurious hotel robe, and watching the stars emerge in the clear valley sky. I called my best friend Sarah in Portland and told her everything that had happened. She was shocked by Patricia's abandonment, but thrilled about my decision to upgrade to the penthouse, especially when I explained the credit card situation. "You realize this is probably the most badass thing you've ever done," Sarah said, and I could hear the grin in her voice. "Your mom basically challenged you to prove you could take care of yourself, and you responded by treating yourself to a luxury vacation on her dime. I'm proud of you for not just slinking home with your tail between your legs." Her words helped me realize that what I was doing wasn't petty revenge. It was a declaration of independence. That night, I took a long bath in the marble tub, using bath salts that probably cost more than my monthly phone bill, and I thought about all the ways my life could change from this point forward. I didn't have to keep accepting Patricia's criticism or trying to earn approval from someone who seemed determined to find me lacking. I didn't have to maintain relationships that made me feel small or unworthy or constantly on the defensive. I was 28 years old, talented, creative, and capable of so much more than my family had ever encouraged me to believe. This penthouse suite was just a temporary taste of luxury, but the confidence I was building, the sense of my own worth that was emerging, those were things I could take with me when I eventually returned to my real life. Except maybe my real life didn't have to be as small as I'd allowed it to become. I fell asleep that second night planning changes I wanted to make when I got back to Portland. I would look for better paying freelance clients, maybe even consider starting my own design firm. I would redecorate my apartment in colors I actually liked instead of the neutral tones Patricia had suggested were more professional. I would date people who appreciated my creativity instead of trying to change me. And I would stop apologizing for taking up space in the world. The third morning brought a surprise that changed everything. I was having breakfast on the terrace, enjoying fresh pastries and perfectly brewed coffee while planning my day's activities, when my phone rang. For a moment, my heart jumped, thinking it might be Patricia finally calling to check on me or perhaps to apologize for the way she'd left. Instead, I saw Sarah's name on the screen. "Julie, you need to see the news," she said without preamble, her voice tight with excitement. "Your mother is all over social media, and it's not good." She guided me to Patricia's Facebook page, and what I saw there made my coffee cup slip from my suddenly nerveless fingers. Patricia had posted a long dramatic message about her ungrateful daughter who had stolen her credit card and was living extravagantly while she was trying to teach important life lessons. The post was full of self-righteous indignation about how I'd betrayed her trust and was clearly not the daughter she'd raised. She'd somehow made herself the victim in the situation, painting me as a manipulative thief who had taken advantage of her generosity. The comments were a mix of supportive friends, echoing her outrage, and others asking pointed questions about why she'd left me at a hotel in the first place. Reading her words, I felt the familiar rush of shame and anger that Patricia's criticism always provoked. But this time, something else rose up alongside those familiar emotions, a fierce protectiveness of the person I was becoming. I thought about the last 3 days, about the confidence I'd been building, the sense of my own worth that had been emerging, and I realized I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. I screenshot the post and several of the comments, then opened my own social media accounts for the first time in months. If Patricia wanted to make this public, then I would tell my side of the story. But I wouldn't do it in anger or desperation. I would do it from my penthouse terrace, looking like the confident, successful woman I was learning to become. I spent an hour crafting my response, choosing my words carefully. I posted a photo of the valley view from my terrace, looking serene and unbothered, with a caption that simply said, "When your family abandons you at a hotel with $20 and a note telling you to learn to take care of yourself, sometimes the best response is to do exactly that. Currently taking excellent care of myself, thanks for asking." I didn't mention the credit card or defend my actions. I simply let the image speak for itself. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Friends who had watched me struggle with my family's criticism for years began commenting with support and admiration. Several people shared their own stories of toxic family dynamics and the difficulty of setting boundaries with people who claimed to love you but consistently made you feel terrible about yourself. The narrative Patricia had tried to create began to crumble, as people realized there was another side to the story. But the real validation came from unexpected sources, colleagues and clients who began reaching out privately to offer work opportunities. Seeing me stand up for myself, refuse to be shamed into submission, had apparently impressed people who had been watching my professional growth for years. I received 3 serious freelance inquiries that day, each offering significantly more money than I was used to making. One message in particular stood out. It was from Marcus Chen, the creative director at a boutique design firm in San Francisco, that I'd always admired but never thought I was qualified to approach. He said he'd been following my work for months and was impressed by what he called my authentic voice and fearless creativity. He wanted to know if I'd be interested in discussing a senior designer position that would double my current income. Sitting on my penthouse terrace, reading messages of support and professional opportunities that I'd never imagined possible, I realized something profound had shifted. By refusing to be ashamed of taking care of myself, by declining to shrink back into the small, apologetic person my family expected me to be, I had somehow opened doors I'd never even known existed. That afternoon, I called Marcus back and scheduled a video interview for the following week. I also responded to the other freelance inquiries, quoting rates that I'd never had the confidence to ask for before. I booked one more night in the penthouse suite, not out of spite but because I wanted to use this space, this sense of luxury and possibility, to prepare for the next chapter of my life. I spent the evening on a video call with a career coach Sarah had recommended, someone who specialized in helping creative professionals advocate for themselves in business settings. She helped me understand that the confidence I'd found in the penthouse wasn't dependent on expensive surroundings or revenge against my family. It was something I'd always possessed, but had been trained to suppress. The most successful people I work with, she explained, are those who refuse to accept other people's limitations on their potential. Your family tried to convince you that you were irresponsible and incapable, but your actions this week prove otherwise. You saw an opportunity, assessed the risks, and made a strategic decision that has already led to professional advancement. That's not irresponsible behavior, that's entrepreneurial thinking. Her words helped me reframe everything that had happened. I hadn't stolen from Patricia, or acted out of petty revenge. I had used available resources to invest in my own growth and professional development. The spa treatments weren't indulgences, They were self-care practices that helped me present my best self to potential employers. The wine tastings and cultural activities weren't frivolous expenses. They were educational experiences that broadened my perspective and could inform my creative work. That night, I drafted my resignation letter from my current part-time position and began planning my move to San Francisco. Marcus had made it clear that the job was mine, if I wanted it, and I was ready for a change that would put me in an environment where ambition was rewarded rather than criticized. I would miss Portland, but I realized I'd outgrown the life I'd built there, the small existence that had felt safe, but had ultimately been limited. I also drafted a careful email to Patricia, not apologizing but explaining my decision to use the credit card and offering to arrange a payment plan if she wanted reimbursement. I didn't expect forgiveness or understanding, but I wanted to handle the situation like the adult she'd claimed I needed to become. I would send it the next morning, after I'd checked out of the penthouse, and was ready to face whatever consequences awaited. As I prepared for sleep in the enormous bed for what I knew would be the last time, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for everything that had happened. Patricia's abandonment, which had initially felt like the worst betrayal of my life, had actually been a gift. It had forced me to discover resources I didn't know I possessed, to take risks I'd never had the courage to consider, and to value myself in ways I'd never learned from my family. I was still hurt by their rejection, still angry about the cruel way they'd chosen to deliver their message, but I was no longer devastated. I had proven to myself that I could not only survive without their approval, but actually thrive. The woman who would check out of this penthouse tomorrow was not the same person who had been abandoned in the lobby 4 days earlier, and that transformation was worth every penny. Patricia's credit card had been charged. Tomorrow I would begin the practical work of rebuilding my life on my own terms, but tonight, I would rest in luxury. I'd earned through my own courage, surrounded by beauty that reflected the worth I was finally learning to recognize in myself. Patricia had wanted me to learn to take care of myself, and I had, just not in the way she'd expected. The fourth morning brought complications I hadn't anticipated. I was awakened not by the gentle California sunshine streaming through the windows, but by the sharp buzzing of my phone against the marble nightstand. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the persistence of the rings made my stomach clench with unease. When I finally answered, still groggy from sleep, a crisp professional voice cut through my drowsiness like a blade. "Miss Jackson, this is Amanda Rodriguez from the Fraud Prevention Department at American Express. We need to discuss some unusual charges on account ending in 4. The blood drained from my face as I realized Patricia had finally noticed the mounting bills and had reported the card as stolen. I sat up straight in bed, my mind racing to formulate a response that wouldn't land me in legal trouble. "I understand there may be some confusion," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm an authorized user on that account. My name should be listed in your system." There was a pause as Amanda presumably checked her computer, and I held my breath, praying that Patricia hadn't removed me from the account in the years since Dad's medical crisis. "I do see your name listed here, Jackson," Amanda said slowly, "but the primary cardholder has contacted us expressing concern about the recent charges. She's requesting that we investigate whether these purchases were made with her consent." My heart sank as I realized Patricia was trying to have it both ways, claiming I'd stolen the card while avoiding admitting she'd deliberately left me stranded. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would either protect me or destroy me completely. "I'd be happy to discuss this matter, but I think there may be some family dynamics at play that your fraud department might not be equipped to handle. My mother left me at this hotel without transportation or adequate funds, and I used the card I'm legally authorized to use to secure safe accommodations, while I arranged my travel home." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally Amanda spoke again, her tone slightly warmer than before. "Mr. Jackson, given that you are indeed an authorized user and the charges appear to be legitimate hotel and hospitality expenses rather than cash advances or suspicious purchases, we're not going to freeze the account at this time. However, we do need to document this conversation for our records." Relief flooded through me, but I knew this reprieve might be temporary. "I understand completely. Is there anything else you need from me? Amanda explained that they would be monitoring the account for any further unusual activity, and that I should expect the primary cardholder to resolve this matter directly with me, rather than through their fraud department. After hanging up, I sat on the edge of the enormous bed and tried to process what had just happened. Patricia had essentially tried to have me arrested for theft, but because I was technically authorized to use the card, her complaint had backfired. The realization that my own mother would rather see me face criminal charges than admit she'd abandoned me filled me with a cold fury that surprised me with its intensity. I ordered room service breakfast, but when it arrived, I found I had no appetite for the elaborate spread of pastries and fresh fruit. Instead, I sat on the terrace with my laptop and began researching my legal rights regarding the credit card situation. What I discovered both relieved and empowered me. As long as I remained an authorized user, I could legally continue using the card until Patricia formally removed me from the account, which would require written notification to both me and the credit card company. The irony wasn't lost on me that Patricia's attempt to control the situation had actually clarified my position and potentially bought me more time. But I also knew that my window of opportunity was closing, and I needed to make the most of whatever time I had left before she figured out how to cut off my access. I spent the morning making strategic purchases that would benefit my long-term goals rather than just providing immediate comfort. I bought a professional wardrobe suitable for my upcoming interview with Marcus Chen, charging everything to the room so it would appear on Patricia's bill as hotel expenses rather than obvious personal shopping. I also booked a session with the hotel's business center to have my portfolio professionally printed and bound, creating marketing materials that would help me land higher-paying freelance clients. The afternoon brought another unexpected phone call, this time from Monica. My sister's voice was tight with anger when I answered, and she immediately launched into an attack that felt rehearsed, as if Patricia had been coaching her on what to say. "Julie, what the hell do you think you're doing? Mom is furious about the credit card charges and she's talking about pressing charges for theft. You need to come home right now and figure out how to pay this money back." Monica's voice carried the same dismissive tone I'd heard from her for years, but this time it didn't have the power to make me shrink into myself. "Monica, I'm not coming home until I'm ready," I said calmly, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "And I'm certainly not going to apologize for using a credit card I'm legally authorized to use after being abandoned at a hotel with $20. I could hear her sharp intake of breath and I knew my response wasn't what she'd expected. "You weren't abandoned," she snapped. "Mom left you money for a taxi. You're being dramatic, as usual." The casual cruelty of her words, the way she minimized what they'd done to me, crystallized something that had been building in my mind for days. This wasn't just about the hotel or the credit card anymore. This was about a fundamental disrespect for my worth as a person that had characterized our family dynamic for years. "Monica, do you realize that $20 wouldn't even cover a taxi to the airport, let alone a flight home? Do you understand that you and Patricia planned this abandonment while I was sleeping in my room believing we were having a family vacation?" My voice was growing stronger with each word, and I felt a power I'd never accessed before rising up from somewhere deep in my chest. "It wasn't abandonment," Monica insisted, but there was less certainty in her voice now. "Mom was trying to teach you independence. You're 28 years old, Julie. You should be able to handle a situation like this without falling apart." The irony of her criticism struck me immediately. I had handled the situation, just not in the way they'd expected or wanted. "You're right," I said, and I could hear the surprise in her silence. "I am 28 years old and I can handle difficult situations. In fact, I've been handling this one quite well. I've secured safe accommodations, arranged for my transportation home, and even managed to advance my career prospects while I've been here. So thank you for the confidence boost." Monica's response was predictably defensive. "Mom says you've been living like some kind of princess on her dime, running up thousands of dollars in charges. That's not handling things responsibly, Julie. That's taking advantage of her generosity." The word generosity almost made me laugh out loud, given the circumstances under which I'd been forced to use the card. "Monica, has it occurred to you that if Patricia didn't want me using this card, she could have removed me as an authorized user at any point in the last 2 years? Has it occurred to you that a truly generous person might have left more than $20 when abandoning someone 500 miles from home?" I was finding my rhythm now, speaking with a clarity and confidence that felt entirely foreign yet completely natural. There was a long pause before Monica spoke again, and when she did, her voice had lost some of its aggressive edge. "Look, Julie, I know the situation wasn't ideal, but you have to understand Mom's perspective. She's been worried about your financial situation for years, and she thought maybe a little tough love would motivate you to make some changes." The phrase tough love sent a spike of anger through me that was so sharp I had to stand up and pace around the terrace to contain it. Tough love would be having an honest conversation about concerns. Tough love would be offering to help me create a budget or find better paying work. Abandonment with a $20 bill isn't tough love, Monica. It's cruelty disguised as concern. I could hear Monica breathing on the other end of the line, and for a moment I wondered if I was finally getting through to her, but when she spoke again, her voice had returned to its earlier defensive tone. "Mom wants you to come home immediately and discuss how you're going to pay back the money you've spent. She's willing to forgive this whole thing if you just apologize and agree to be more responsible in the future." The offer hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment that would define my relationship with my family forever. I could apologize, return home with my tail between my legs, and accept whatever limitations they wanted to place on my life. Or I could refuse their terms and face the consequences of choosing myself over their approval. "Tell Patricia that I'll be happy to discuss the credit card charges when I return to Portland," I said finally, "but I won't be apologizing for taking care of myself when my family chose not to. And I definitely won't be agreeing to let her dictate my financial decisions going forward." Monica's sharp intake of breath told me this wasn't the response she'd been hoping for. "Julie, you're making a huge mistake. You're going to lose your family over this ridiculous tantrum." The word tantrum was clearly meant to diminish me, to make me feel childish and unreasonable for standing up for myself. But instead of shame, I felt a profound sadness for the toxic dynamic that had shaped our relationships for so long. "Monica, if treating myself with basic respect and refusing to accept abandonment means losing my family, then maybe this family isn't worth keeping." The words came out before I could stop them, and once they were spoken, I realized I meant them completely. The silence that followed was deafening. "I hope you know what you're doing," Monica said finally, her voice cold and distant, "because after this, don't expect things to go back to the way they were." She hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me standing on the terrace with my phone in my hand, and a strange sense of liberation spreading through my chest. I sat down heavily in one of the comfortable chairs and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 2 phone calls, I had essentially severed my relationship with my family, and chosen a path that would require me to rebuild my entire support system from scratch. The magnitude of that decision should have terrified me, but instead I felt oddly calm, as if I'd finally stopped fighting against a current that had been pulling me towards something better all along. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of practical preparations for my new life. I confirmed my interview time with Marcus Chen, and researched the San Francisco job market for freelance designers. I also began the process of changing my address with various institutions, preparing for a move I hadn't planned but now felt inevitable. That evening, I had dinner at a small restaurant in town rather than staying at the hotel, partly to give myself a break from the luxury that had become my temporary normal, and partly to test how I felt about being Julie Jackson, independent woman, in a more typical set. The restaurant was charming and unpretentious, the kind of place where locals went for good food and conversation without worrying about impressing anyone. I sat at the bar and struck up a conversation with the bartender, a woman named Carmen, who had moved to Napa from Los Angeles 5 years earlier, to escape what she called the grind. As we talked about career changes and family expectations, I found myself sharing more about my situation than I'd intended, though I kept the details vague. "The hardest part about changing your life," Carmen said as she polished glasses, "is accepting that some people won't understand or support your choices, but the people who matter will respect you for having the courage to choose yourself." Her words resonated with something deep in my chest, and I realized she was articulating something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to name. I walked back to the hotel that evening with a sense of clarity about my next step. I would extend my stay one more day to attend a networking event for creative professionals, that Carmen had told me about. I would use that time to practice presenting myself as the confident, successful designer I was becoming rather than the insecure woman I'd been. And then I would return to Portland, pack my things, and move to San Francisco to start the next chapter of my life. Back in the penthouse, I spent the evening updating my portfolio and preparing for the networking event. I selected pieces that showcased not just my technical skills, but my unique creative vision, the authentic voice that Marcus Chen had mentioned in his message. Looking at my work with fresh eyes, I could see the evolution in my style over the past few years, the way my confidence as an artist had grown even as my personal relationships had become more strained. I also wrote a detailed email to my current clients, explaining that I would be relocating to San Francisco and transitioning to higher-end projects that better aligned with my career goals. I offered to complete any ongoing work remotely and to recommend other designers for future projects that might not fit my new direction. The process of writing these emails felt like shedding an old skin, letting go of a version of myself that had been defined by scarcity and self-doubt. As I prepared for bed, I checked my phone one last time for messages from Patricia or Monica. There were none, and I realized their silence was actually a gift. It gave me space to think clearly about what I wanted without the pressure of their immediate reactions or demands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I would rest in the knowledge that I had chosen courage over comfort, growth over stagnation. The fifth morning arrived with an unexpected sense of anticipation rather than anxiety. I woke before dawn and sat on the terrace watching the sun rise over the valley, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed to promise something beautiful ahead. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I felt genuinely excited about the future rather than simply determined to survive it. The networking event was being held at a boutique gallery in downtown Napa, and I spent the morning getting ready with the kind of care I usually reserve for job interviews or special occasions. But this wasn't about impressing anyone else. It was about honoring the person I was becoming by presenting her to the world with confidence and style. The dress I'd chosen was one of my new purchases, a deep navy blue that complemented my eyes and made me feel both professional and approachable. With my new haircut and the confidence I'd been building over the past few days, I looked in the mirror and saw someone I barely recognized, a woman who belonged in rooms where creative professionals gathered to discuss their work and ambition. The gallery was filled with artists, designers, photographers, and creative entrepreneurs from throughout Northern California. As I walked through the space, viewing the artwork and listening to conversations about upcoming projects and collaborative opportunities, I felt a sense of belonging I'd never experienced in my hometown networking event. These were people who understood that creativity was not a frivolous pursuit, but a legitimate and valuable form of work. I struck up conversations with several other designers, sharing my portfolio on my tablet and learning about the creative community in San Francisco. One woman, Elena Vasquez, who ran a successful branding agency in the city, was particularly encouraging about my work and mentioned that she was always looking for talented freelancers for overflow projects. "There's something about your aesthetic that feels very authentic," Elena said as she scrolled through my portfolio. "A lot of designers try to follow trends or copy what they think clients want, but your work has a distinct voice. That's rare and valuable." Her words echoed what Marcus Chen had said, and I began to understand that what I'd always seen as my inability to fit into established molds was actually my greatest professional strength. By the end of the event, I had collected business cards from 6 potential clients and had been invited to submit proposals for 2 immediate projects. More importantly, I had spent 3 hours presenting myself as the creative professional I was rather than apologizing for my career choices or minimizing my accomplishments. The experience was intoxicating, and I realized how much energy I'd been wasting over the years by trying to make myself smaller to accommodate other people's limited vision of my potential. Driving back to the hotel that evening, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of what the past week had really been about. Yes, I had been abandoned by my family in a cruel and thoughtless way. Yes, I had used Patricia's credit card to fund a luxury experience that was far beyond my usual means, But more than anything, I had discovered who I could become when I stopped accepting other people's definitions of my worth and possibility. That night, I made the final arrangements for my transition to San Francisco. I accepted Marcus Chen's job offer via email, giving my official start date as 3 weeks from Monday to allow time for relocating and settling into the city. I also reached out to Elena Vasquez to discuss the freelance projects she'd mentioned, feeling confident enough to quote rates that reflected the true value of my work rather than what I thought clients might be willing to pay. I spent my last evening in the Penthouse suite, writing in the journal I'd started keeping during my stay, documenting not just the events that had transpired, but the internal transformation that had accompanied them. Reading back over my entries from the first day, I could see the evolution in my thinking, the way I'd moved from feeling victimized and abandoned to feeling empowered and purposeful. The woman who had been left in the hotel lobby with $20 and a dismissive note would have crawled back home, apologized for being a burden, and accepted whatever scraps of attention her family was willing to offer. But the woman who would check out of this penthouse tomorrow was someone entirely different, confident, professionally ambitious, and unwilling to settle for relationships that required her to diminish herself. As I packed my new clothes and the materials from the business center, I realized that the most expensive thing I was taking with me wasn't purchased with Patricia's credit card. It was the knowledge that I deserved to take up space in the world, to pursue my ambitions without apology, and to surround myself with people who celebrated my growth rather than trying to contain it. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah in Portland. Just saw your posts from the networking event. You look amazing and so confident. Can't wait to hear all about your new life in San Francisco. Her words reminded me that while I might be losing my family of origin, I had friends who truly supported my happiness and success. That realization felt like the final piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for years. Tomorrow I would begin the journey back to Portland to collect my belongings and close that chapter of my life. But tonight I would sleep one last time in the luxury I'd claimed for myself, surrounded by beauty that reflected the worth I was finally learning to recognize. Patricia had meant to teach me a lesson about responsibility and independence, and I had learned it thoroughly, just not in the way she'd intended. The lesson wasn't that I needed to accept less or apologize for wanting more. The lesson was that I had the power to create the life I wanted, with or without my family's approval. And that knowledge was worth every penny charged to Patricia's platinum card, every moment of uncertainty I'd endured, and every relationship I'd had to leave behind to claim it. The drive back to Portland felt like traveling between two different versions of my life. I had rented a car using Patricia's card for what I knew would be the final purchase before I lost access, and as I wound through the mountains separating Napa Valley from my old reality, I found myself gripping the steering wheel with a mixture of determination and dread. Behind me lay the confidence and clarity I'd discovered in the penthouse suite. Ahead waited the confrontation I'd been avoiding, and the practical challenges of dismantling a life I'd outgrown. My apartment building looked smaller than I remembered, more run down and cramped after a week of marble countertops and panoramic views. As I climbed the narrow stairs to my second-floor unit, carrying my bags of new clothes and professional materials, I felt like an actress returning to an old set, where she'd once played a role she no longer recognized. The key turned stiffly in the lock, and when I pushed open the door, the stale air and dim lighting made my chest tighten with claustrophobia. Everything was exactly as I'd left it a week ago, but my perspective had shifted so dramatically that familiar objects looked foreign and somehow small. The second-hand furniture I'd been proud to afford, the neutral wall colors I'd chosen because they were safe, the stack of bills on my kitchen counter that I'd been carefully managing with my modest freelance income, all of it felt like evidence of a life I'd been living in black and white without realizing color was an option. I set my bags down in the living room and immediately opened all the windows, desperate for fresh air and natural light. Then I sat on my old couch, the one Patricia had helped me pick out 3 years ago because it was practical and wouldn't show stains, and tried to prepare myself for what I knew was coming. My phone had been buzzing intermittently during the drive with calls from numbers I didn't recognize, and I suspected word of my return had somehow reached Patricia. The first call came within an hour of my arrival. This time Patricia didn't bother with pleasantries or pretend concern. Her voice was ice cold with fury when I answered. and she launched immediately into an attack that confirmed she'd been planning this conversation for days. Julie Marie Jackson, you get yourself over to my house right now. We are going to settle this credit card situation once and for all, and you are going to explain how you justify stealing from your own mother. The use of my full name transported me instantly back to childhood, to every lecture and punishment and disappointment that had shaped my understanding of my place in the family hierarchy. But instead of the familiar shrinking sensation I'd always felt when Patricia used that tone, I found myself sitting straighter on my couch and speaking with a calm that surprised us both. Patricia, I didn't steal anything. I used a credit card I'm legally authorized to use after you abandoned me at a hotel. If you have concerns about the charges, we can discuss them like adults, but I won't be spoken to like a misbehaving child. The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if the call had dropped. When Patricia finally spoke again, her voice was lower but somehow more dangerous. How dare you speak to me that way? After everything I've done for you, everything I've sacrificed to try to make you into a responsible adult, this is how you repay me. By embarrassing our family and acting like some kind of entitled princess. Her words hit all the familiar buttons, pushing me toward the guilt and shame that had controlled my behavior for years. But something had fundamentally changed during my week away, and instead of collapsing into apologies, I found myself analyzing her tactics with startling clarity. She was using shame as a weapon, trying to make me feel small and wrong for refusing to accept mistreatment. Patricia, what exactly have you sacrificed for me? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you spent years criticizing my career, my choices, and my financial situation, then abandoned me 500 miles from home, with $20 when I didn't transform into the person you wanted me to be. My voice was steady, almost clinical, and I could hear her sharp intake of breath at my directness. I was trying to teach you independence, she snapped, but there was less conviction in her voice now. You're 28 years old, Julie. You should be able to handle a minor inconvenience without falling apart and running up my credit card like you're living in some fantasy world. The phrase minor inconvenience was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. A minor inconvenience would be missing a bus or having to walk a few extra blocks. Abandonment by your family in an unfamiliar location without adequate resources is not a minor inconvenience. Patricia, it's a betrayal of the most basic level of care that family members owe each other. I was finding my rhythm now, speaking with the same confidence I'd used at the networking event, refusing to let her reframe the narrative. Don't you dare lecture me about family loyalty, Patricia said, her voice rising. I raised you, fed you, clothed you, paid for your education. I've spent 28 years trying to turn you into a functioning adult, and this is what I get for my efforts. A daughter who steals from me, and then has the audacity to act like she's the victim. The word steals triggered something fierce in my chest, and I stood up from the couch, pacing to the window as I spoke. I didn't steal anything, and you know it. You left my name on that credit card account for 2 years after Dad died. If you didn't want me using it, you could have removed me at any time. Instead, you kept me as an authorized user while simultaneously criticizing my financial decisions and independence. That card was for emergencies only, Patricia shot back, but I could hear the weakness in her argument. Hotel spa treatments and expensive dinners are not emergencies, Julie. They're the indulgences of someone who has no concept of financial responsibility. Her criticism was so familiar, so predictable, that I realized I'd been having this same conversation with her for years in different forms. You're right, I said, and I could hear her pause, probably expecting me to collapse into familiar patterns of apology and self-criticism. Hotel spa treatments aren't emergency, but being abandoned by your family absolutely is an emergency, and I handled it by securing safe accommodations and using my time productively to advance my career. If you wanted to control how I responded to your abandonment, you shouldn't have abandoned me in the first place. I want you here in 30 minutes, Patricia said, clearly realizing that her usual tactics weren't working and trying to regain control through demands. We're going to go through every charge on that credit card statement, and you're going to explain how you plan to pay back every penny. Her assumption that I would immediately comply with her orders revealed how little she understood about the person I'd become. Patricia, I'm not coming to your house to be lectured like a teenager. If you want to discuss the credit card charges, We can meet somewhere neutral and have a conversation between adults, but I won't subject myself to whatever performance you have planned to make me feel guilty for taking care of myself." The suggestion of meeting somewhere neutral clearly hadn't occurred to her, and I could hear her fumbling for a response. "You'll come here because I'm your mother and I'm telling you to," she said, finally, falling back on the authority that had worked when I was a child but carried no weight, now that I'd discovered my own power. "And you'll show some respect while we figure out how you're going to fix this mess you've created. The only mess here is the toxic dynamic you've created by treating me like a burden instead of a daughter," I said, my voice calm but unmistakably fine. "I'm willing to discuss the financial aspects of this situation, but I won't be attending any more family meetings where the goal is to shame me into submission. If you want to have a productive conversation, let me know. Otherwise you can communicate with me through your lawyer." I hung up before she could respond, my hands trembling slightly with adrenaline but my mind clearer than it had been in years. I had just refused to participate in the family dynamic that had controlled my life for decades, and instead of feeling guilty or afraid, I felt liberated. Whatever consequences followed, I would face them as the person I was becoming rather than the person I'd been trained to be. The phone rang again immediately, but this time, it was Monica. Her voice was tight with panic when I answered, and I could tell Patricia had called her within minutes of our conversation ending. "Julie, what the hell is wrong with you? Mom is furious, and she's talking about getting lawyers involved. You need to fix this right now before it gets completely out of hand." "Monica, what needs to be fixed is the fact that our mother abandoned me at a hotel, and is now trying to criminalize my survival," I said, settling back onto my couch with a calmness that felt almost supernatural. "I'm not interested in participating in family drama anymore. If Patricia wants to involve lawyers, that's her choice, but she'll discover that I haven't done anything illegal." "You used her credit card without permission," Monica insisted, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. "That's theft, Julie. You could go to jail for this." Her attempt to frighten me into compliance was so transparent that I almost felt sorry for her, trapped as she was in the same system of manipulation that had controlled me for years. "Monica, I was an authorized user on that account. I have every legal right to use that card, and Patricia knows it. She's trying to scare me into backing down because she can't admit that abandoning me was wrong." I was amazed by how calmly I could explain the situation, how little power their threats held now that I understood my actual position. "But the amounts you spent," Monica said, her voice getting higher with distress. "Mom showed me the statements, Julie. You spent over $15,000 in a week. That's insane. That's not taking care of yourself. That's living in a fantasy world." The number was higher than I'd calculated, but instead of shame, I felt a strange pride in the investment I'd made in my own transformation. "Monica, that $15,000 bought me a career opportunity that will increase my income by $40,000 a year. It bought me professional clothing, networking opportunities, and the confidence to value my work appropriately. If you want to talk about fantasy worlds, let's discuss the one where a family abandons someone with $20 and expects them to be grateful for the experience." There was a long pause before Monica spoke again, and when she did, her voice was smaller, more uncertain. "Julie, I know the way we left wasn't ideal, but you have to understand the pressure Mom's been under. She's been worried about your finances for years, and she thought maybe if you had to handle a difficult situation on your own, you'd finally step up and take charge of your life." The word ideal to describe abandonment was so inadequate that I had to bite back a laugh. "Monica, if Patricia was worried about my finances, she could have offered to help me find better paying work or create a budget. If she wanted me to take charge of my life, she could have encouraged my ambitions, instead of constantly criticizing my choices. Abandonment isn't tough love, it's cruelty." "She's not cruel," Monica protested, but there was less conviction in her voice than usual. "She's just frustrated, because she feels like you never listen to her advice or make the changes she suggests. She wants what's best for you, Julie. We both do." The phrase "what's best for me" triggered a flash of anger so intense I had to stand up and pace around my small living room. "Monica, what's best for me is being treated with basic respect and having my autonomy acknowledged. What's best for me is not being abandoned by my family when I don't conform to their expectations. And what's definitely not best for me is continuing to pretend that Patricia's controlling behavior is motivated by love instead of her need to feel superior. You're being really unfair, Monica said, but I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice. Mom has always been there for us. She supported us through college, helped us get started in our careers, made sacrifices so we could have opportunities she never had. Her defense of Patricia sounded rehearsed, like arguments she'd been having with herself for years. Monica, Patricia supported the versions of us that she approved of. She helped us when we followed her script and punished us when we deviated from her plan. That's not unconditional love. That's conditional acceptance, based on our compliance with her expectations. I was articulating something I'd never been able to put into words before, and speaking it aloud felt like unlocking a door I'd been pushing against for decades. So what are you saying, that we should just cut Mom out of our lives because she's not perfect? That we should throw away our family because she made some mistakes? Monica's voice was rising with distress, and I could hear her desperation to maintain the family structure that had defined our identities for so long. I'm saying that I'm not willing to accept mistreatment in the name of family loyalty anymore. If Patricia wants a relationship with me, she needs to acknowledge that abandoning me was wrong and commit to treating me with respect going forward. If she's not willing to do that, then she's choosing to end our relationship, not me. The silence that followed was so long I thought Monica had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Julie, if you don't come over here and apologize, Mom says she's going to press charges for theft and fraud. She's already talked to her lawyer, and he thinks she has a case because the amounts are so large. The threat should have terrified me, but instead I felt a cold clarity settling over my thoughts. Monica, tell Patricia that if she wants to press charges, she should go ahead. I'll be happy to explain to a judge why I used a credit card I was legally authorized to use after being abandoned by my family. I'll also be happy to discuss her failure to provide adequate support, and her attempt to use the legal system to avoid taking responsibility for her action. You can't be serious, Monica breathed. This is our family, Julie. This is Mom. You can't really be willing to destroy everything over a hotel bill. Her incredulity revealed how completely she'd absorbed Patricia's narrative about the situation, how incapable she was of seeing my perspective. Monica, I'm not destroying anything. I'm refusing to be destroyed by people who claim to love me but treat me like an enemy when I don't behave exactly as they want. If that's what destroys our family, then it was never worth preserving in the first place. My words hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I could hear Monica crying softly on the other end of the line. I don't understand how you became so cold, she said finally. This isn't the Julie I grew up with. That Julie would never have hurt Mom like that. That Julie cared about her family more than her own pride. Her accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. I wasn't the same person who had left for Napa Valley a week ago. You're right, I said quietly. The Julie you grew up with would have crawled home apologizing and begging for forgiveness after being abandoned. She would have accepted blame for other people's cruel behavior, and spent years trying to earn back approval she never should have lost. But that Julie was miserable, Monica. She was anxious and insecure, and constantly walking on eggshells, trying to be perfect enough to deserve love from people who used that love as a weapon. So you're just going to throw us away? Monica asked, her voice thick with tears. You're going to choose your pride over your family? Her question revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had always existed between us, the way she confused self-respect with selfishness. I'm choosing my mental health over dysfunction. I'm choosing growth over stagnation. I'm choosing relationships based on mutual respect over relationships based on control and manipulation. If that means losing my family of origin, then I'll build a new family with people who actually want me to succeed and be happy. Monica hung up without saying goodbye, leaving me alone in my apartment with the enormity of what I'd just done settling around me like dust. I had essentially ended my relationship with both Patricia and Monica in the span of 2 phone calls, choosing my own well-being over their approval for the first time in my adult life. The silence that followed felt both terrifying and peaceful. I spent the evening packing my belongings with a methodical efficiency that surprised me. I was moving to San Francisco in 2 weeks, and suddenly the prospect of starting completely over felt like exactly what I needed rather than something to be feared. As I sorted through clothes, books, and personal items, I found myself discarding things that represented the person I'd been, rather than the person I was becoming. The framed photos of family gatherings went into a box marked for storage rather than display. The conservative business clothes Patricia had helped me choose for client meetings went to a donation pile. The self-help books about managing finances and building confidence, gifts from Patricia that had always made me feel like a project to be fixed, went directly into the trash. What I kept were the things that represented my authentic self, my art supplies, my portfolio of creative work, the books that had inspired me, the clothes that made me feel confident and beautiful. I packed these items carefully, treating them like treasures that would form the foundation of my new life rather than burdens to be managed. My phone rang several more times that evening, but I let the calls go to voicemail. Patricia left increasingly angry messages demanding that I call her back immediately, threatening legal action and disownment with equal fervor. Monica left tearful messages begging me to reconsider, to think about the family memories we'd be losing, to remember how much they loved me despite their imperfect ways of showing it. Listening to their messages, I felt sad but not swayed. Their love had always come with conditions and expectations that required me to diminish myself to receive it. They loved the version of me that was compliant and grateful, and willing to accept whatever scraps of affection they offered. They had never loved the real me, the ambitious, creative, independent woman I was finally allowing myself to become. I called Sarah that evening to let her know about my conversations with Patricia and Monica, and her response was exactly what I needed to hear. "Julie, I am so proud of you for standing up for yourself. I've watched you shrink yourself for years trying to please people who were never going to be satisfied, unless you stayed small and manageable. You deserve so much better than that." "I'm scared," I admitted, sitting on my couch surrounded by packed boxes. "I've never been without my family before, even when our relationship was difficult. I don't know how to navigate the world without their approval, even if that approval was impossible to earn." Sarah's voice was warm with understanding when she responded, "Julie, you've been navigating the world without their real support for years. You built a career they didn't respect, supported yourself financially without their help, and created a life they constantly criticize. The only thing you're losing is their judgment and control, and those were never assets to begin with." Her words helped me see the situation from a different perspective, and I realized she was right. Patricia and Monica had been emotional burdens rather than sources of strength for years. They had criticized my successes, undermined my confidence, and demanded gratitude for the privilege of their disapproval. I had been carrying them rather than being supported by them. That night, I slept better than I had in my own bed for months, maybe years. The decision to choose myself over their expectations had lifted a weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as I prepared for my move to San Francisco, but tonight I could rest in the knowledge that I had finally stopped fighting a battle I was never meant to win. I woke the next morning to find 17 missed calls from Patricia and a text message that made my blood run cold. "Since you want to play hardball, I've contacted my lawyer and the police. You have until noon to return my credit card and discuss restitution, or I'm filing charges for theft and fraud. This is your last chance to handle this privately." The threat was clearly meant to terrify me into submission, but instead I felt a calm determination settling over my thoughts. If Patricia wanted to make this a legal matter, then I would handle it legally. I called the lawyer whose business card I'd kept from my father's estate planning, and when I explained the situation, his response was reassuring. "Julie, as an authorized user on the account, you have every legal right to use that credit card for any purpose. The amounts might be unusual, but they're not illegal. If your mother wants to pursue this legally, she'll have to prove that you exceeded your authority as an authorized user, which would be very difficult given that the card company approved all the transactions." His confidence gave me the strength I needed to face whatever came next. I called Patricia back at exactly noon, and when she answered with her voice full of cold triumph, I spoke with a clarity that surprised us both. Patricia, I've spoken with my lawyer and he's advised me that I haven't committed any crime. If you want to pursue this legally, you're welcome to do so, but you should know that I'll be documenting your abandonment of me and your attempts to use the legal system to avoid taking responsibility for your action. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about the strength of her legal position. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its threatening edge and taken on a note of desperation. Julie, this doesn't have to become a legal battle. We can work this out as a family if you'll just be reasonable. Patricia, being reasonable would have been leaving me with adequate resources when you abandoned me. Being reasonable would have been having an honest conversation about your concerns instead of staging an elaborate abandonment. Being reasonable would be acknowledging that your behavior was wrong and committing to treating me with respect going forward. I will not be lectured by my own daughter, she snapped, but I could hear the uncertainty underneath her anger. You used my credit card to fund a luxury vacation, and now you're trying to make me the villain for expecting you to take responsibility for your actions. Her attempt to reframe the narrative was so transparent that I almost felt sorry for her. Patricia, I used your credit card to secure safe accommodations after you abandoned me. What I did with my time and resources while I was securing those accommodations is not your concern. If you don't want me to use your credit card in the future, you can remove me as an authorized user, but you cannot punish me retroactively for handling an emergency you created. It wasn't an emergency, she protested, but there was less conviction in her voice now. It was a learning experience designed to help you develop independence and responsibility. Her continued insistence that abandonment was education revealed how completely she'd convinced herself that her cruelty was actually kindness. Patricia, if you want to help me develop independence, then you need to start by respecting the independence I've already achieved. I'm moving to San Francisco in 2 weeks to start a job that pays twice what I was making before. I've secured new clients and expanded my professional network. I've handled this situation exactly as an independent, responsible adult would handle it. By maxing out my credit card, she asked, but the question sounded more confused than angry now. I realized that she genuinely didn't understand how I could view my actions as responsible, how completely our perspectives on the situation diverge. By investing in my professional development and using available resources to advance my career goals, Patricia, that $15,000 is going to return itself within 6 months through increased income and better opportunity. It was the smartest financial decision I've ever made, even if you can't see it that way. The conversation ended without resolution, with Patricia hanging up in frustration when she realized I wouldn't be shamed or threatened into the compliance she expected. But I felt victorious anyway, because I had stood my ground and articulated my position without backing down or apologizing for choices I believed in. Over the next few days, I received sporadic text from both Patricia and Monica, alternating between threats and pleas, but I didn't respond to any of them. I was done trying to explain myself to people who were determined to misunderstand me, done wasting energy on relationships that required me to sacrifice my growth for their comfort. Instead, I focused on preparing for my new life in San Francisco, researching neighborhoods and apartments, connecting with the creative community I'd met at the networking event, and completing the freelance projects that would give me a financial cushion during my transition. Each day brought me closer to the life I was building for myself rather than the life others expected me to live. The woman who would drive away from Portland in 2 weeks was not the same person who had been abandoned in that hotel lobby. She was stronger, clearer about her worth, and unwilling to accept less than she deserved from anyone, family included. And if that transformation had cost Patricia $15,000 and her illusion of control over my life, then it was a bargain at twice the price. The morning I was scheduled to leave Portland, Patricia showed up at my apartment without warning. I was loading the last of my boxes into the rental truck when I heard her car door slam in the parking lot below, and the sound sent a familiar spike of anxiety through my chest. But this time, instead of the helpless dread I'd always felt when facing her anger, I experienced something closer to irritation at the interruption of my carefully planned departure. I continued securing the boxes with bungee cords while listening to her footsteps on the stairs, each step deliberate and heavy with the authority she'd wielded over me for 28 years. When she reached my landing and saw me through the open door, Her face was a mask of cold fury that would have sent me scrambling to apologize just weeks ago. Now, I simply nodded acknowledgement and kept working. "We need to talk," she announced, stepping into my empty apartment without invitation and surveying the bare walls and packed boxes with obvious disapproval. Her presence immediately made the space feel smaller and more oppressive, as if she carried a cloud of judgment that sucked the air out of any room she entered. I finished tying down the last box before turning to face her direct. "Patricia, I told you I wasn't interested in having this conversation. I'm leaving for San Francisco in 30 minutes, and I have everything timed precisely to avoid traffic." I kept my voice level and matter of fact, treating her like an unwelcome salesperson, rather than the authority figure she'd always been in my life. The shift in dynamic was clearly visible in her expression, which flickered between confusion and rage. "You are not leaving this city without settling what you owe me," she said, her voice carrying the tone she'd used when I was a teenager caught breaking curfew. $15,000 doesn't just disappear because you've decided to have a tantrum and move away. You're going to sit down and work out a payment plan, and you're going to apologize for the embarrassment you've caused this family. The word tantrum was clearly chosen to diminish me, to reduce my carefully considered life decisions to the emotional outburst of a child. But instead of the shame and confusion it would have triggered in my old life, I felt a cold clarity about exactly what she was trying to do and why it wouldn't work anymore. "Patricia, I don't owe you anything. I used a credit card I was legally authorized to use, and I've already spoken with a lawyer who confirmed that no crimes were committed. If you want to pursue reimbursement, you can take it up with the credit card company or file a civil suit, but I won't be bullied into compliance anymore." Her eyes widened slightly at my directness, and I could see her recalibrating her approach. She'd expected to find the anxious, apologetic daughter she'd always been able to manipulate, and my calm refusal to engage with her drama was clearly not the scenario she'd prepared. "Julie, I am trying to be reasonable here," she said, switching to the tone she used when she wanted to appear like the mature adult dealing with an unreasonable child. "I know you're angry about how things ended at the hotel, and maybe we could have handled that situation differently, but running up my credit card like some kind of revenge fantasy was not an appropriate response." The phrase "maybe we could have handled that differently" was as close to an acknowledgement of wrongdoing as I was likely to get from Patricia, but it fell far short of the accountability I would have needed to consider rebuilding our relationship. Her attempt to frame my actions as revenge also revealed how completely she'd missed the point of everything that had happened. "Patricia, what I did wasn't revenge, it was survival and strategic planning. I used the resources available to me to secure safe accommodations and advance my career prospects. The fact that it cost you money is unfortunate, but it's a direct consequence of your decision to abandon me without adequate support." "I did not abandon you," she snapped, her careful composure cracking slightly. "I left you with money for transportation and expected you to handle a simple travel situation like an adult. The fact that you chose to turn it into some kind of luxury vacation adventure instead of just coming home shows exactly the kind of irresponsible thinking I was trying to correct." Her insistence on reframing abandonment as a learning opportunity would have been almost laughable if it weren't so consistent with decades of gaslighting that had shaped my understanding of reality. But standing in my empty apartment, surrounded by the evidence of the new life I was building, I could see her tactics clearly for the first time. "Patricia, $20 wouldn't have covered a taxi to the airport, let alone airfare home. You left me stranded deliberately, expecting me to panic and beg for help so you could rescue me on your terms. When I handled the situation independently instead, you decided to punish me for not following your script." "That is not what happened," she said, but there was less conviction in her voice now. "I was trying to help you develop confidence and problem-solving skills. Everything I've ever done has been to help you become a stronger, more capable person." Her rewriting of history was so complete that I wondered if she actually believed her own narrative. "Patricia, abandoning someone is not how you help them develop confidence. Supporting their goals, respecting their choices, and treating them with basic human dignity is how you help them develop confidence. What you did was cruel, and calling it education doesn't change that." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling to process my refusal to accept her version of events. In her mind, she was the long-suffering mother dealing with an ungrateful daughter who couldn't appreciate the valuable lessons she was trying to teach. The possibility that her methods were harmful rather than helpful was not something she could acknowledge without dismantling her entire self-concept. "I don't know what happened to you in that hotel," she said finally, her voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "But you came back changed, Julie. You came back selfish and ungrateful and willing to hurt the people who love you most. That's not the daughter I raised." Her words were meant to wound me, to make me doubt the transformation I'd undergone, and long for her approval badly enough to revert to my old pattern. But instead of hurt, I felt a kind of sad relief at finally understanding how little she knew or cared about who I really was. "You're right," I said quietly. "I did come back changed. I came back with boundaries and self-respect and a clear understanding of my own worth. If that makes me selfish and ungrateful in your eyes, then I'll accept those labels rather than go back to being anxious and apologetic and constantly seeking approval from people who withhold it as a form of control." Patricia's face went pale, and for a moment I thought I saw something that might have been genuine hurt rather than manufactured outrage, but it passed quickly, replaced by the familiar mask of righteous indignation that had defined her response to any challenge to her authority. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "If this is the choice you're making, if you'd rather throw away your family than admit you were wrong, then that's your decision to live with. But don't expect me to be here when you realize what you've lost. Don't expect forgiveness when you come crawling back asking for another chance." The threat of permanent rejection was her final weapon, the ultimate consequence she'd always held over my head to ensure compliance. But instead of the terror it would have inspired in my younger self, I felt only a tired resignation that she would rather lose me entirely than examine her own behavior. "Patricia, I'm not throwing away my family. I'm refusing to participate in toxic dynamics that require me to diminish myself to receive love. If you decide that means cutting me out of your life permanently, that's your choice, not mine." I walked to the door and held it open, making it clear that our conversation was over, whether she was ready or not. She stood in my empty living room for another long moment, looking around at the space where I'd lived for 3 years as if she were memorizing it for evidence in some future trial. When she finally walked toward the door, she paused directly in front of me, with her face set in the expression of wounded dignity she'd perfected over years of playing the victim in conflicts she'd created. "I hope you know what you're doing, Julie," she said, her voice heavy with the implication that I was making the biggest mistake of my life. "Because once you walk out that door and choose this path, there's no coming back. I won't spend the rest of my life chasing after a daughter who doesn't want to be part of this family." "I understand," I said simply, and I could see that my lack of distress at her ultimatum was perhaps the most shocking part of our entire confrontation. She'd expected tears, begging, desperate promises to change if she'd only give me another chance. Instead, she was facing a woman who was willing to let her walk away rather than accept mistreatment for the privilege of her presence. She left without another word, and I closed the door behind her with a finality that felt like the end of a chapter I'd been trying to finish for years. I stood in the empty apartment listening to her car start and drive away, and instead of the devastating loss I should have felt, there was only a profound sense of relief that I would never again have to brace myself for her criticism or walk on eggshells to avoid triggering her disappointment. I finished loading the truck in the silence that followed her departure, moving with a efficiency that surprised me. Each box that went into the vehicle was a piece of my old life being consciously transported to my new one, but also a decision about what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. I was literally packing up my independence and driving it toward a future that belonged entirely to me. The drive to San Francisco felt like traveling through a portal between dimensions. With each mile that passed, the weight of family expectations and disappointed obligations lifted from my shoulders, replaced by a lightness I'd never experienced in my adult life. I wasn't just moving to a new city for a better job. I was escaping a gravitational pull that had kept me small and anxious for nearly 3 decades. I arrived at my new apartment in the Mission District, just as the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed to welcome me to the West Coast. The building was a converted Victorian with high ceilings and original hardwood floors, nothing like the sterile apartment complex I'd left behind in Portland. Even before I'd moved in my furniture, the space felt more like home than anywhere I'd ever lived. My new neighbor, a graphic artist named Carmen who worked for one of the tech companies downtown, helped me carry boxes up the stairs and immediately invited me to join her and her roommate for pizza and wine on their roof deck. Sitting under string lights with people who knew nothing about my family drama and cared only about my creative work and future plans, I felt like I was experiencing normal human relationships for the first time. "So what brought you to San Francisco?" Carmen asked as we shared a bottle of wine and watched the city lights spread out below us. The question was casual, friendly, with no hidden agenda or judgment lurking underneath. I found myself telling them about the job opportunity and my excitement about joining a creative community that valued innovation over conformity. I didn't mention Patricia or the hotel or the credit card situation. Those events felt like they belonged to a different person, someone who had needed dramatic external circumstances to discover her own worth. The woman sitting on that roof deck was someone new, someone who understood that her value wasn't dependent on other people's approval or measured by their willingness to support her dreams. My first day at Marcus Chen's design firm confirmed that I'd made the right choice in every possible way. The office was exactly what I'd imagined a creative workspace should be, open and bright with collaborative spaces and individual studios, where artists could develop their personal vision while contributing to larger projects. My colleagues treated me like a valued professional rather than a junior employee who needed constant supervision and correction. Marcus pulled me aside during lunch on my first day to tell me how impressed he'd been with my portfolio and to discuss the projects he was hoping I'd take the lead on in the coming months. "We've been looking for someone with your aesthetic for over a year," he explained. "Most designers try too hard to follow trends or copy what they think clients want, but your work has an authenticity that's rare in this industry." His words echoed what Elena Vasquez had said at the networking event, and I began to understand that the creative voice I'd always been insecure about was actually my greatest professional asset. The quirky, unconventional elements that Patricia had always criticized as unprofessional were exactly what distinguished my work from the generic designs that flooded the market. Within 2 weeks of starting my new job, I'd been assigned to 3 major projects and had received inquiries from potential freelance clients who'd heard about my work through the creative community. My income had more than doubled, and for the first time in my adult life I was earning money doing work I was genuinely passionate about rather than just grateful to have. I opened a new bank account and transferred the emergency fund I'd been building for years from my Portland account, money I'd saved by living small and anxious and constantly worried about financial catastrophe. Looking at the balance, I realized I could afford to live comfortably while still saving for future goals, something that had never seemed possible when I was spending emotional energy on managing family criticism and trying to earn approval through financial responsibility. 3 weeks after moving to San Francisco, I received a text message from Monica that I almost deleted without reading. But curiosity got the better of me and I opened it to find a picture of Patricia sitting alone at a restaurant table set for 3, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen her. The message read, "This was supposed to be our monthly family dinner. She set a place for you anyway. I hope you're happy with your choices." The image was clearly meant to make me feel guilty, to visualize the family harmony I was supposedly destroying through my selfishness and ingratitude. But looking at Patricia's carefully composed expression of wounded dignity, I felt only a tired sadness for the performance she was staging rather than the genuine grief that might have motivated a real attempt at reconciliation. I didn't respond to Monica's text, but I did show it to Carmen, who'd become my closest friend in the weeks since I'd moved to the city. Her reaction was immediate and decisive. "Julie, that's emotional manipulation of the highest order. Healthy families don't stage photo shoots of their sadness to guilt-trip estranged relatives into compliance." Her words helped me see the situation clearly, and I realized that Patricia was still trying to control me even from a distance, using Monica as a messenger to deliver carefully crafted images designed to make me doubt my choices. The fact that she was performing her abandonment rather than genuinely experiencing it revealed how little she understood about love versus control. I blocked both Patricia's and Monica's numbers that evening, not out of anger but out of a recognition that I needed to protect the peace and confidence I'd built in my new life. Every message from them, whether angry or pleading, pulled me back toward the anxious, uncertain person I'd been rather than supporting the growth and happiness I was experiencing. A month into my new life, I received an unexpected call from my lawyer in Portland. Patricia had indeed consulted with an attorney about pursuing legal action against me, but after reviewing the case, the lawyer had advised her that she had no grounds for criminal charges and very little chance of success in a civil suit. More importantly, he'd apparently warned her that pursuing the matter could result in counterclaims for emotional distress and abandonment. "She's dropped the whole thing," my lawyer explained. Her attorney made it clear that taking this to court would likely result in more publicity and scrutiny than she's comfortable with, especially since you were technically authorized to use the card and used it during what most reasonable people would consider an emergency situation. The news that Patricia had finally given up her legal threats should have felt like a victory, but instead it just felt like closure. She'd exhausted all her options for forcing me back into compliance, and now we could both move forward with the understanding that our relationship was truly over unless she was willing to make fundamental changes to how she treated me. I celebrated that evening by taking myself to dinner at one of the restaurants I'd bookmarked during my first week in the city, a place with a view of the bay where I could sit alone with a good book and excellent food without feeling like I needed to justify my solitude to anyone. The woman eating dinner alone at that waterfront restaurant was confident, professionally successful, and surrounded by a community of people who valued her contributions, rather than seeing her as a problem to be managed. My second month in San Francisco brought opportunities I couldn't have imagined in my old life. Elena Vasquez invited me to collaborate on a branding project for a startup that was launching a platform for independent artists, work that perfectly combined my design skills with my understanding of the creative community. The project fee alone was more than I'd made in 3 months of freelance work in Portland. I also started teaching a weekend workshop for aspiring designers at a local art center, sharing the technical skills and business knowledge I'd accumulated over years of building my career from nothing. My students were hungry, talented people who reminded me of myself at their age, and helping them avoid some of the mistakes I'd made felt like a way of honoring the struggle that had brought me to this point. Standing in front of that classroom, watching young artists develop confidence in their abilities and learn to value their unique perspectives, I understood something that had eluded me for years. My difficult relationship with Patricia hadn't been a personal failing or evidence that I was somehow defective as a daughter. It had been the inevitable result of two incompatible approaches to life: her need to control versus my need to grow. 3 months after leaving Portland, I was invited to speak at a conference for women in creative industries about building sustainable freelance careers. As I prepared my presentation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the anxious, financially struggling designer who'd been abandoned at a luxury hotel to the confident professional who was now advising others on career development. The talk went better than I'd hoped, with audience members approaching me afterward to share their own stories of family pressure and career transitions. Several women mentioned that they'd been struggling with similar dynamics, feeling torn between pursuing their creative ambitions and maintaining relationships with family members who didn't understand or support their choices. "The hardest part," one woman told me, "is accepting that choosing yourself isn't selfish, especially when you've been taught that putting your own needs first is the worst thing you can do." Her words perfectly captured the internal shift that had made my transformation possible, the recognition that self-care and boundary setting were not acts of cruelty but necessary foundations for healthy relationship. I realized that my experience at the hotel, dramatic as it had been, was just an extreme version of a choice that many people face: whether to continue accepting mistreatment in the name of family loyalty, or to risk rejection by insisting on respect and autonomy. My story had resonated with the audience because the underlying dynamic was universal, even if the specific circumstances were unusual. 4 months into my new life, I received a letter from Patricia that had been forwarded from my old address in Portland. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, not from fear but from the muscle memory of anxiety that her contact had triggered for so many years. The letter was typed rather than handwritten, formal and carefully worded in a way that suggested she'd drafted and redrafted it multiple times. The content was everything I'd expected and nothing I'd hoped for. She acknowledged that mistakes were made during our family vacation, but maintained that her intentions had been good, and that my response had been disproportionate to the situation. She offered to put this behind us if I would acknowledge my part in the conflict and agree to more mature communication going forward. The letter was a masterclass in non-apology, taking minimal responsibility while placing the burden of reconciliation on me and framing my boundary setting as immaturity. There was no recognition of the harm she'd caused, no understanding of why her behavior had been unacceptable, and no indication that she was willing to change her approach to our relationship in any meaningful way. I read the letter twice, then filed it away without responding. Patricia was offering me the same relationship we'd always had, with the same power dynamics and the same expectation that I would sacrifice my well-being for her comfort. But I was no longer interested in that arrangement, no matter how prettily it was packaged or how many family obligations were invoked to justify it. That evening I called Sarah to update her on everything that had happened since moving to San Francisco. She listened to my description of the letter and my decision not to respond with the kind of unwavering support I'd never received from my family of origin, but had learned to expect from the chosen family I was building. "Julie, you sound so different than you did 6 months ago," she said toward the end of our conversation. "You sound confident and settled in a way I've never heard before. Whatever happened at that hotel, whatever you did with that credit card, it was exactly what you needed to become the person you were meant to be." Her words helped me understand that the real value of my week at the Grandview Resort hadn't been the luxury accommodations or the networking opportunities, or even the professional advancement that had followed. It had been the discovery that I could take care of myself in ways I'd never been allowed to explore, that I could make decisions based on my own judgment, rather than other people's expectations. The woman who had been abandoned at that hotel with $20 and a dismissive note had been constrained by a lifetime of conditioning that told her she was irresponsible, financially naive and incapable of handling difficult situations independently. The woman who had upgraded to the Penthouse suite and used Patricia's credit card to fund her transformation had discovered that all of those limitations were imposed from the outside rather than reflecting any actual deficiency in her character or capabilities. 6 months after leaving Portland, I was promoted to senior designer at Marcus's firm and was approached by a publisher who wanted me to write a book about building creative careers outside traditional institutional structure. The financial security I'd always struggled to achieve was no longer a source of anxiety, but a foundation that allowed me to take bigger risks and pursue more ambitious projects. I'd also developed a social circle of artists, entrepreneurs, and creative professionals who supported each other's growth rather than trying to contain it. These relationships felt fundamentally different from anything I'd experienced with my family of origin, because they were based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and control. Standing on my apartment balcony 6 months after moving to San Francisco, looking out over a city that had embraced my ambitions rather than questioning them, I felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Patricia's abandonment, intended as punishment for my failure to meet her expectations, had actually been the catalyst that freed me to exceed any expectations I'd ever had for myself. The $15,000 charged to her credit card had been the best investment either of us had ever made, even if she would never see it that way. It had purchased my freedom from a dynamic that was slowly destroying my confidence and creativity, and it had funded the discovery of capabilities I'd never been encouraged to develop. I thought occasionally about whether Patricia and Monica were happy with the family they'd preserved by excluding me, whether they'd found the peace and harmony they'd expected once the difficult daughter was no longer there to complicate their narrative. But those thoughts came without pain now, more like wondering about distant acquaintances than grieving lost relationship. The family I'd built in San Francisco, the community of people who celebrated my successes and supported my challenges, felt more real and substantial than the biological connections I'd lost. These relationships were chosen rather than inherited, maintained through mutual care rather than guilt and obligation, and they grew stronger rather than more strained as I became more successful and confident. As I prepared for sleep in my beautiful apartment, surrounded by work I was proud of and relationships that nourished rather than depleted me, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge or proving anyone wrong. I had simply chosen to become the person I was capable of being rather than the person others needed me to remain, and that choice had led to a life that exceeded anything I'd previously imagined possible. The woman who would wake up tomorrow to continue building her career and deepening her friendships bore little resemblance to the anxious, apologetic person who had been abandoned at a luxury hotel 7 months ago. But she carried the wisdom gained from that experience, the unshakable knowledge that she was capable of thriving even under the most challenging circumstances, and that no one else's approval was worth sacrificing her own growth and happiness. 1 year after moving to San Francisco, I received an invitation that would have terrified the person I used to be, but filled my current self with quiet satisfaction. The Grandview Resort was hosting an exclusive designers retreat, bringing together creative professionals from across the country to collaborate on innovative hospitality branding projects. As one of the featured speakers on authentic brand storytelling, I was being offered a complimentary stay in their signature accommodations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was returning to the scene of my transformation as a celebrated professional rather than an abandoned daughter. I accepted the invitation immediately, curious to experience the resort through the lens of the confident, successful woman I'd become rather than the anxious, seeking approval person who had first walked through those marble lobby doors. Driving up the familiar winding road to the Grandview Resort felt like watching a movie of someone else's life. The landscape was exactly the same, rolling hills covered in vineyards that stretched toward distant mountains, but my relationship to the beauty had fundamentally changed. Instead of feeling like an outsider grateful for temporary access to luxury, I felt like someone who belonged in beautiful spaces because I'd learned to value my own presence in them. The valet who took my keys treated me with the professional courtesy reserved for VIP guests, and as I walked through the lobby where I'd once sat clutching that devastating note from Patricia, I felt only a mild curiosity about the woman I'd been rather than any residual pain from what had happened here. The marble floors and crystal chandeliers were still impressive, but they no longer felt like symbols of a world I could never truly access. My suite was on the top floor with a view that encompassed the entire valley, and as I unpacked my designer luggage filled with clothes that reflected my personal style rather than someone else's idea of professionalism, I marveled at how completely my circumstances had changed. The woman unpacking in this luxury suite owned her success rather than borrowing it, had earned her place here through recognized expertise rather than stolen access. The first evening's welcome reception was held on the same terrace where I'd once sat planning my future while soaking in the private hot tub I'd charged to Patricia's credit card. Now I was mingling with other industry leaders, discussing collaborative projects and sharing insights about creative entrepreneurship with people who valued my perspective rather than tolerating my presence. During the cocktail hour, I struck up a conversation with Rebecca Martinez, the resort's director of brand development, who mentioned that they were looking for a creative consultant to help rebrand their luxury experiences for a younger, more diverse clientele. As she described their vision for authentic, inclusive hospitality that celebrated individual creativity rather than conforming to traditional luxury stereotypes, I realized she was describing exactly the kind of project I'd become known for in San Francisco. We want to move away from the stuffy, intimidating luxury that makes people feel like they have to prove they belong here, Rebecca explained as we walked along the terrace railing. We want to create spaces where creativity and authenticity are celebrated, where guests feel empowered to be themselves rather than diminished by pretentious elegance. Her words perfectly captured the shift I'd experienced in my own relationship with luxury and success. By the end of the evening, she'd invited me to submit a proposal for a comprehensive rebranding project that would include everything from visual identity to customer experience design. The potential contract was worth more than I'd made in my entire first year as a freelancer, and it would establish me as a leading voice in hospitality branding, opening doors to similar projects at resorts and hotels around the world. As I prepared for bed in my elegant suite, I reflected on the cosmic justice of being hired to transform the very place where I'd been transformed. The scared, financially struggling woman who'd once hidden in a bathroom stall in this building, trying not to have a panic attack after being abandoned, was now being courted as an expert consultant who could help the resort evolve beyond the exclusionary practices that had once made her feel so unwelcome. The next morning brought the first working session of the retreat, where I was scheduled to present a keynote on authentic brand storytelling in the digital age. Standing at the podium in the resort's main conference room, looking out at an audience of accomplished professionals who'd come specifically to hear my insights, I felt a profound appreciation for the journey that had brought me to this moment. My presentation focused on the importance of vulnerability and genuine experience in creating brand narratives that resonated with modern consumers. I shared case studies from my work with startups and established companies, demonstrating how authentic storytelling could differentiate brands in saturated markets and build lasting emotional connections with audience. The most powerful brand stories, I explained to the engaged audience, come from real transformation, from founders and leaders who've experienced genuine challenges and emerged with hard-won wisdom. Consumers can sense the difference between manufactured authenticity and the real thing, and they're increasingly choosing to support brands that represent genuine growth and evolution. During the question and answer session, one participant asked how I'd developed my approach to authentic storytelling, and I found myself sharing a carefully edited version of my own transformation story. I spoke about a period of personal crisis that had forced me to reevaluate my relationship with success and luxury, leading to insights about the difference between borrowed status and earned confidence. Sometimes the most valuable experiences are the ones that strip away your assumptions about yourself and force you to discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Thinking about that first night in the Penthouse suite, when I'd made the decision to invest in my own growth rather than accept the limitations others had placed on me, those experiences become the foundation for authentic leadership and genuine creative vision. The response to my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with several attendees approaching me afterward to discuss potential collaborations and consulting opportunities. One woman, a hotel owner from Austin, mentioned that she'd been struggling to articulate her vision for hospitality that felt both luxurious and accessible, and my framework for authentic brand development had given her the language she needed. These conversations reinforced something I'd learned over the past year. My experience of transformation, as difficult as it had been at the time, had given me insights that were valuable to other creative professionals and business leaders. The pain of being abandoned and the challenge of rebuilding my life from scratch had taught me lessons about resilience, self-advocacy, and authentic success that I couldn't have learned any other way. That afternoon, I participated in a workshop on collaborative design processes, working with teams of architects, interior designers and hospitality experts to develop concepts for experiential luxury that prioritized emotional connection over material opulence. Our team's proposal centered around creating spaces that celebrated guests' individual creativity and encouraged them to engage with the environment as collaborators rather than passive consumers. The project felt deeply personal because it represented everything I'd learned about the difference between intimidating luxury that made people feel small and empowering luxury that helped people discover their own capacity for greatness. We designed flexible spaces that could be customized to reflect guests' interests and creative practices, amenities that supported personal growth rather than just indulgence, and programming that brought together creative professionals for genuine collaboration rather than superficial networking. During the evening's dinner presentation, each workshop team shared their concepts with the full group of retreat participants. When our team presented our vision for transformative luxury hospitality, the response was enthusiastic and immediate. Rebecca Martinez approached me afterward to discuss incorporating our concepts into the resort's rebranding project, and several other attendees mentioned interest in applying similar principles to their own hospitality venture. "What I love about your approach," Rebecca said as we stood on the terrace after dinner, "is that it acknowledges luxury should enhance people's sense of their own worth rather than making them feel inadequate or excluded. Too much traditional luxury hospitality has been about making guests feel grateful for access rather than empowered by the experience." Her words perfectly captured the revelation I'd had during my own stay at this resort the year before. Traditional luxury had always made me feel like an imposter, someone who was temporarily borrowing access to a world where I didn't truly belong. But the luxury I'd created for myself through strategic risk-taking and self-investment had felt entirely different because it was earned rather than granted. On my final morning at the retreat, I took a walk through the resort grounds, retracing some of the paths I'd explored during my week of transformation. The landscape was exactly the same, but my relationship to it had evolved completely. Instead of feeling like a trespasser in someone else's paradise, I felt like someone who understood that beauty and luxury were available to anyone willing to claim them through authentic effort and strategic courage. I stopped at the spot where I'd once sat planning my future with Maya's backpack clutched to my chest, trying to figure out how to survive Patricia's abandonment without losing my sense of self. The woman sitting on that bench had been terrified but determined, desperate but resourceful. She'd made decisions that seemed impossible at the time but had led to opportunities she couldn't have imagined. Standing in that same location a year later, I felt immense gratitude for her courage and creativity. She'd used every resource available to her, including Patricia's credit card, to invest in possibilities, rather than just survival. Her refusal to accept the limitations others had placed on her had created the foundation for everything I'd achieved since. I pulled out my phone and took a selfie, not for social media but for my own documentation of how far I'd traveled from that desperate morning when I'd first discovered Patricia's note. The woman in the photo was confident, professionally successful, and surrounded by opportunities that reflected her authentic capabilities, rather than other people's limited expectations. The drive back to San Francisco felt like completing a circle that had begun with my traumatic departure from this same location a year earlier. But instead of fleeing in a rented car with my belongings hastily packed and my future uncertain, I was returning home to a life I'd built entirely according to my own vision and value. The following week, I submitted my proposal for the Grandview Resort rebranding project, incorporating everything I'd learned about authentic luxury and transformative hospitality during the retreat. The proposal was comprehensive, including visual identity concepts, customer experience mapping, and employee training programs, designed to create genuinely inclusive luxury rather than superficially accessible pretension. Rebecca called me 3 days later to offer me the contract, explaining that the resort's ownership team had been unanimously impressed with my vision and eager to begin implementation immediately. The project would span 18 months and establish the Grandview Resort as a model for next-generation luxury hospitality, with the potential for me to consult on similar transformations at properties around the world. Signing that contract felt like the ultimate vindication of every risk I'd taken and every bridge I'd burned in my journey toward authentic success. The same resort where Patricia had intended to teach me humility and financial responsibility was now paying me more money than I'd ever imagined possible to help them evolve beyond the exclusionary practices that had once made me feel so unwelcome. 6 weeks later, I received an unexpected email from Monica that I almost deleted without reading. Curiosity eventually won out, and I opened it to find a message that was very different from her previous attempts at guilt-tripping and manipulation. She'd seen an article about my work with the Grandview Resort in a hospitality industry magazine, and her tone was more confused than angry. "Julie, I saw your name in a trade publication that one of my clients received. I had no idea you were doing such high-level work or that you'd become such a recognized expert in your field. I'm genuinely confused about how everything went so wrong between us, and I wonder if there's any way we could have a conversation about where things stand." Her message was still framed around her confusion rather than any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, but it was the first communication from my family of origin that didn't include threats, demands, or attempts to make me feel guilty for my choices. I considered responding, but ultimately decided that even well-intentioned contact from Monica would require me to relitigate decisions I'd already made and boundaries I'd already established. Instead, I forwarded the email to Carmen, who'd become my closest friend and most trusted advisor during my year in San Francisco. Her response was immediate and characteristically direct. "Julie, success has a way of making people reconsider relationships they were perfectly happy to discard when you were struggling. The fact that Monica is suddenly interested in reconciliation now that you're professionally recognized tells you everything you need to know about the conditional nature of her affection." Her words helped me maintain clarity about the dynamics that had always defined my family relationship. Patricia and Monica had been content to exclude me from their lives when they perceived me as a burden or embarrassment, but my professional success had apparently made me worth reconsidering. That kind of conditional acceptance was exactly what I'd worked so hard to escape. 3 months into the Grandview Resort project, I was invited to speak at a conference for women entrepreneurs about overcoming family resistance to non-traditional career paths. My presentation, titled "When Choosing Yourself Means Losing Your Family," resonated with an audience of women who'd faced similar challenges in pursuing creative and entrepreneurial ambition. During the question and answer session, one woman asked how I'd developed the courage to prioritize my own growth over family approval, especially given the financial risks involved. Her question gave me an opportunity to share the fuller version of my transformation story, including the role that strategic risk-taking had played in discovering my authentic capability. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who claim to care about you is refuse to enable their controlling behavior, I explained to the rapt audience. When you accept mistreatment to maintain relationships, you're teaching people that your well-being is less important than their comfort, and that's not sustainable for anyone involved. After my presentation, dozens of women approached me to share their own stories of family pressure and career sacrifice. Many had stayed in limiting situations because they'd been taught that choosing themselves was selfish, and hearing about my journey had given them permission to consider their own growth and happiness as legitimate priority. These conversations reinforced my understanding that my experience at the Grandview Resort, dramatic as it had been, represented a universal challenge that many creative and ambitious women face. The specific circumstances of being abandoned at a luxury hotel were unusual, but the underlying dynamic of choosing authentic success over conditional approval was something that resonated across different backgrounds and situations. As the first-year anniversary of my transformation approached, I decided to celebrate by hosting a dinner party at my San Francisco apartment for the community of friends and colleagues who'd supported my growth over the past year. These were people who'd known me only as the confident, successful professional I'd become, and their affection was based on who I actually was, rather than who they needed me to be. Looking around my dining table at artists, entrepreneurs, and creative professionals who celebrated each other's successes rather than feeling threatened by them, I felt a profound appreciation for the family I'd chosen rather than the family I'd lost. These relationships were maintained through mutual respect and genuine care rather than obligation and control, and they grew stronger rather than more strained as each person became more successful and fulfilled. During dinner, Carmen raised a toast to the courage to choose growth over comfort and authenticity over approval, and as we clinked glasses filled with wine I could afford because of work I was passionate about, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong and everything to do with proving myself right. The woman who'd been abandoned at the Grandview Resort had made a bet on her own potential rather than accepting the limitations others had placed on her, and that bet had paid off in ways she couldn't have imagined. She'd discovered that financial security, professional recognition, and meaningful relationships were all possible when she stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world and started claiming the success she was capable of achieving. As I prepared for bed that night in my beautiful apartment, surrounded by work I was proud of and relationships that nourished rather than depleted me, I felt grateful for every difficult decision that had brought me to this point. Patricia's credit card had purchased more than luxury accommodations and professional networking opportunities. It had bought my freedom from a life that was slowly suffocating my creativity and ambition. The $15,000 she'd considered theft had actually been the best investment either of us had ever made, even if she would never see it that way. It had funded my discovery that I was capable of thriving under pressure, making strategic decisions independently, and creating opportunities rather than just waiting for them to be offered. Most importantly, it had taught me that my worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval or measured by their willingness to support my dream. The confidence I'd built during that week of transformation had become the foundation for everything I'd achieved since, and no amount of family pressure or guilt could diminish the knowledge that I deserved to live a life that reflected my authentic capabilities and aspirations. The next morning, I woke up ready to begin year 2 of the life I'd built entirely on my own terms, surrounded by people who celebrated my growth rather than trying to contain it, pursuing work that utilized my unique talents rather than asking me to diminish them. The woman looking back at me in the mirror was someone I'd had to discover rather than someone I'd been taught to become, and that discovery had been worth every penny charged to Patricia's platinum card and every relationship I'd had to leave behind to claim it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.